My stepmom abandoned me and my 6-year-old half-brother when Dad died. Years later she came back. And I made sure she paid for it. Let me take you back to where it all began. My parents divorced when I was just 6 years old. Mom and Dad would fight constantly, screaming matches that echoed through our small house in suburban Denver like thunder before a storm. They were clearly miserable together, taking their frustrations out on each other with words that cut deeper than any knife ever could. My sanctuary became Lincoln Elementary School, just 3 blocks from our house. While other kids complained about school, I cherished every moment there. I'd watch my classmates chatting happily about family barbecues and weekend trips, while I dreaded the sound of our front door closing behind me each afternoon. Mom was what you'd politely call a homemaker, though that term felt generous. After finishing the bare minimum of household chores, she'd plant herself on our faded brown sectional for hours, mindlessly watching soap operas and talk shows. Looking back now, I recognize the signs of severe depression, the way she'd stare blankly at the TV screen, barely acknowledging my presence when I'd return from school. She never asked if I'd eaten lunch or how my day went. Mrs. Rodriguez, my best friend Katie's mom, would pick us up and drop us off together since we lived so close. Mom would remain glued to that couch until it was time to start dinner, and even then, her cooking was hit or miss. Some nights we'd have perfectly seasoned pot roast, other nights the mashed potatoes would be so salty they were inedible. Dad worked construction and would come home exhausted, covered in dust and desperately wanting a decent meal. When dinner was terrible, which happened more often than not, the arguments would begin. If Dad ever brought home McDonald's or Subway, Mom would explode, screaming about how she could cook better than those dirty fast food workers, and how he was throwing money away. Their fights always followed the same pattern. It would start with food, escalate to finances, then spiral into personal attacks about each other's families and deepest insecurities. Dad would criticize Mom for spending all day like a vegetable on the couch, while Mom would fire back about his modest income as a construction worker. These verbal wars would rage until one of them stormed off, usually Dad heading to the garage to tinker with his Ford F-150. When they finally told me about the divorce over a dinner of overcooked spaghetti and burnt garlic bread, I felt nothing but relief. I didn't cry or protest, I actually felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. But my lack of emotional reaction infuriated Mom. She started questioning whether I was some kind of psychopath for not being upset. When I honestly told her I was happy they were separating, she went ballistic. "You're just as selfish as your father," she screamed, her face turning red. "You don't care what happens to me. Nobody in this family loves or respects me." Her accusations came out of nowhere, and I couldn't understand why I was suddenly the target of her rage. During the divorce proceedings, Mom's erratic behavior became impossible to ignore. The court ordered a psychological evaluation after several concerning incidents, including one where she threw a plate at the wall during a custody meeting. The diagnosis came back as bipolar disorder with severe depression. The judge deemed her unfit for custody, awarding Dad full parental rights. Dad and I moved into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment across town, closer to his construction site. The neighborhood was rough, sirens wailing at all hours, neighbors arguing loudly through thin walls. But Dad promised it was temporary. "Just give me a year, kiddo," he'd say, ruffling my hair. "I'll pick up overtime shifts, and we'll get somewhere better." True to his word, 12 months later we moved to Maplewood Heights, a quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns. That's where everything changed, because that's where we met Veronica. Veronica Martinez lived 3 houses down from our new place on Elm Street. She was everything Mom wasn't, energetic, put together, always smiling. She had 2 golden retrievers, Buddy and Princess, who immediately won my 8-year-old heart. Whenever she'd visit Dad, I'd spend the entire time playing fetch in our backyard with those dogs. At first, Veronica seemed wonderful. She was respectful, staying out of my way while slowly building a relationship with Dad. I'd watch through the kitchen window as they'd sit on the front porch swing, talking for hours while I played with her dogs. She worked as a dental hygienist and always arrived straight from work, still wearing her cheerful scrubs covered in cartoon characters. The change began subtly when she started spending nights over. Suddenly, my homework time wasn't sacred anymore. "Why is Aria watching TV when she could be helping with dishes?" she'd ask Dad, her voice sweet but pointed. "Shouldn't an 8-year-old be learning some responsibility around the house?" Mind you, I was 8 years old. I could barely reach the kitchen counter without a step stool, but Veronica expected me to wash my own dishes and throw tantrums when I forgot. Dad, who was clearly smitten after years of loneliness, didn't see these as red flags. He was love-struck, probably grateful to have found someone who seemed stable after Mom's chaos. When Veronica officially moved in with her dogs, she delivered an ultimatum that left Dad and me speechless. I needed to give up my bedroom for Buddy and Princess. They're used to having their own space, she explained matter-of-factly. Aria could sleep in that cute little nook under the stairs. It would be like having her own private hideaway. I was terrified of that dark, cramped space under the staircase. I broke down crying, which led to Dad and Veronica's first major argument. She threatened to leave, but Dad stood firm. That's Aria's room, and the dogs can sleep in the living room or with us. They eventually compromised when Dad built an elaborate doghouse in our backyard, complete with insulation and heating for Colorado winters. But Veronica never forgave me for not being accommodating. From that day forward, the dogs were off-limits to me. If Buddy or Princess even approached me, she'd sharply call them away. The playful afternoons I'd cherished were over. I noticed Veronica quit her job at Dr. Patterson's dental office right after moving in. Dad never mentioned whether they discussed this decision, but suddenly she had endless time to scrutinize everything I did. She'd complain that I was too quiet, too messy, too this, too that. When Dad and I planned our traditional Saturday trips to see the latest Pixar movies at the Cinemark Theater, she'd insist on coming but then try to convince him to see romantic comedies instead. "Don't you think Aria's a little old for cartoon movies?" she'd suggest while we stood in line for tickets. Dad never budged, which I could tell frustrated her more. Despite their disagreements about me, Dad and Veronica had genuine chemistry. They'd laugh together over morning coffee, dance to oldies in the kitchen while making dinner, share inside jokes I didn't understand. I couldn't figure out why someone who seemed to love my dad so much could resent his daughter so deeply. When I turned 11, Veronica's criticism intensified. According to her, I was too introverted for a normal kid, and socially awkward. She'd compare me to her cheerleading days at Boulder High, regaling us with stories of her popularity and social success. "I just don't understand why Aria doesn't have more friends," she'd tell Dad. At her age, I was already captain of the JV squad. She also had issues with my sleep schedule, particularly on weekends when I'd sleep until 9 a.m. "Lazy teenagers make lazy adults," she'd declare, even though I was barely 11. No matter what I did, setting earlier alarms, helping with household chores without being asked, trying to be more social, there was always something new to criticize. Her constant negativity began affecting my self-esteem in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I started feeling anxious whenever she was around, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering another lecture. The worst part was that during my most anxious moments, the critical voice in my head started sounding exactly like hers. Everything came to a head during a family barbecue when I was 12. Veronica had invited her parents and siblings to our house for the 4th of July. I'd spent the morning playing basketball with neighborhood kids and came home starving, like any normal teenager would. But when I loaded my plate with Dad's famous barbecue ribs and corn on the cob, Veronica pulled me aside. "It's selfish to eat that much when food wasn't prepared for you specifically," she whispered harshly. "You're embarrassing me in front of my family by acting like a pig." When I pointed out that Dad had bought and prepared all the food, she doubled down. "You're being a terrible stepdaughter, and if you can't control yourself, maybe you should eat inside." That moment crystallized everything wrong with our relationship, but it was just the beginning of what was to come. When I turned 13, Dad and Veronica dropped a bombshell. They were having a baby. They broke the news over dinner at Olive Garden, both of them practically glowing with excitement. Dad explained that Veronica had proposed, and they'd be getting married before the baby arrived to do things right. I felt completely numb. While they chattered about wedding plans and nursery colors, all I could think was that Dad was making the same mistake twice, rushing into marriage with someone who clearly resented his daughter. But what could a 13-year-old do? I forced a smile and congratulated them. Their courthouse wedding was small and quick. Veronica's parents, Harold and Beverly, flew in from Phoenix to serve as witnesses alongside me. For their honeymoon, Veronica insisted on a week in Aspen, leaving me with her parents while they were gone. Harold and Beverly were carbon copies of their daughter, judgmental and invasive. They peppered me with inappropriate questions about Mom's mental health and abandonment, then had the audacity to suggest I was probably just as damaged due to genetics. They made me feel like I was some kind of charity case Dad had taken on, acting like Veronica was a saint for dealing with me. "You should feel grateful Veronica married your father despite his baggage," Beverly told me one evening while Harold nodded approvingly. Their words made me feel worthless, like I was nothing more than an obstacle to their daughter's happiness. When Dad and Veronica returned from Aspen, I could tell the dynamic had shifted. Veronica was now officially the lady of the house, and she wasted no time establishing her authority. She assigned me more chores, taking out trash daily, cleaning the stove after every meal, cooking dinner every Wednesday for the three of us. Even when I completed tasks to the best of my ability, she'd find something to critique. "This isn't how you properly clean a stovetop, Arya," she'd say, redoing my work while I watched. But when it was her turn to clean, any imperfections were mysteriously acceptable. The baby arrived 2 months early, a tiny fragile boy they named Connor. From the moment I saw him in the NICU, hooked up to monitors and breathing tubes, he felt like my little brother. I didn't feel jealous or resentful. If anything, I felt protective. Being an only child had been lonely, and having a sibling felt like a gift. Connor was a fussy baby who cried frequently throughout the night. Dad would take the night shift, walking the halls with Connor until dawn, then crash for a few hours before heading to work. Veronica would take over during the day, but the moment I got home from Roosevelt Middle School, she'd hand Connor to me like I was hired help. "Change his diaper if he cries," she'd instruct, already heading for her afternoon nap. "There's formula in the fridge if he's hungry." I understood that new parents were exhausted, but Veronica treated me like a built-in babysitter rather than her stepdaughter. If I made plans with friends to see a movie or hang out at the mall, she'd guilt-trip me about abandoning the family and being selfish when everyone needed to pitch in. Dad, to his credit, tried to maintain boundaries. "Let Arya be a teenager," he'd tell Veronica. "She's got her whole life to worry about adult responsibilities." But everything changed when Dad had to travel to Las Vegas for a 3-day construction conference. With Dad gone, Veronica's expectations became unreasonable. She expected me to handle Connor's nighttime feedings and diaper changes, treating me like a co-parent rather than a 13-year-old kid. "As a young woman, you need to learn childcare," she'd say when Connor would cry at 2 a.m. "No man will want to marry someone who can't handle babies." She taught me to prepare bottles, check temperatures, burp techniques, even how to give Connor baths. When he cried, she'd yell from her bedroom for me to handle it, as if I were his mother, not his teenage half-sister. By the time Dad returned, I was completely exhausted and overwhelmed. I broke down and told him everything, how Veronica had essentially made me Connor's primary caregiver for 3 days straight. Dad was furious and confronted Veronica immediately. Their argument was explosive. Veronica screamed that she never wanted to be a mother, and this whole thing was a mistake. She packed her bags and left that very night, abandoning both Dad and 2-month-old Connor. Dad spent weeks calling and begging her to come home. He had to take family leave from work because Connor needed round-the-clock care. Harold and Beverly called to berate Dad for not appreciating their daughter and supporting me over Veronica. "Every family expects the oldest child to help with babies," Beverly lectured. "That's just how things work." Maybe Dad was exhausted from single parenting, or maybe he felt helpless without Veronica's income, but when she finally returned after a month, he didn't have the energy to fight anymore. He allowed her to continue treating me like Connor's secondary parent, and our relationship began deteriorating for the first time in my life. Veronica moved Connor's crib into my room, so she wouldn't be disturbed at night. She'd cancel my plans with friends, claiming family emergencies that required my babysitting services. When Connor started crawling, she demanded I baby-proof my own bedroom for his safety. For the first time ever, I began resenting Dad. He'd come home late deliberately to avoid hearing me complain about Veronica, allowing his wife to essentially parentify me to save his marriage. I realized then that if I ever wanted independence, I'd have to earn it myself. So I threw myself into academics, determined to get as far away as possible. I spent my high school years at Cherry Creek High with one singular focus: escape. I studied relentlessly, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while juggling my responsibilities with Connor and the endless household chores Veronica assigned me. She'd made Connor sleep in my room permanently, claiming she and Dad needed their rest for work, though she still hadn't returned to her job at the dental office. My nights became a cycle of homework, feeding Connor, changing diapers, and getting maybe 4 hours of sleep before school. If I had plans with my boyfriend Jake or my study group, Veronica would either cancel them outright or threaten to take away my phone. Family comes before your social life, she'd declare, as if I weren't already sacrificing everything for a child who wasn't even mine. When Connor learned to walk, Veronica expected me to chase him around our house, making sure he didn't hurt himself on furniture corners or stairs. Meanwhile, she'd spend afternoons at Starbucks with her book club friends or getting her nails done at the salon downtown. The breaking point came during my junior year when I was accepted to Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship. I'd applied secretly, researching schools that were far from Colorado and had strong programs in business administration. When I told Dad about my acceptance, he was proud but clearly conflicted. Veronica, however, was livid. "You deliberately chose a school that's 1,000 miles away," she accused during one of our kitchen confrontations. "You're abandoning Connor when he needs his big sister most. Family should come before some fancy college degree." I stood my ground for the first time in years. "I earned this scholarship, and I'm going to Northwestern whether you like it or not." "Find something closer to home," she demanded. "Connor needs you here, and I need help with him. Your education can wait." That's when I realized she'd never planned for me to leave. In her mind, I was permanent free childcare, destined to sacrifice my future for her convenience. Jake helped me move into my dorm that August. Dad was supportive but distant, tired of mediating between Veronica and me. Veronica didn't even say goodbye, giving me the silent treatment for weeks before I left. At Northwestern, I finally felt free. I made friends who didn't know about my complicated home life, joined the business club, and discovered who I was when I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells. My contact with Dad remained regular, but Veronica refused to speak to me entirely. During my sophomore year, everything changed with a single phone call. I was studying in the library when my phone buzzed with Dad's ringtone. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, unusual timing for him. When I answered, I could hear chaos in the background, shouting, glass breaking, Connor crying. "Arya." Dad's voice sounded strained and exhausted. "Dad, are you okay? What's all that noise?" There was a long pause before he said the words that shattered my world: "I have stomach cancer." I made him repeat it 3 times before it sank in. Stage 3 stomach cancer, diagnosed just that afternoon after weeks of dismissing persistent pain as work-related stress. The chaos I'd heard was Veronica's reaction to the news. "She's threatening to leave," Dad explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Says she can't handle being married to a dying man. Says this isn't the life she signed up for." I was furious. What kind of person abandons someone because they get sick? "She keeps saying she wants more from life, that she never pictured herself as a caregiver," Dad continued. "I think she's been looking for an excuse to leave for a while." Every child's worst nightmare is losing their parent, and I refused to spend Dad's remaining time stuck in Chicago while he suffered alone. I talked to my professors, arranged to complete assignments remotely, and booked the next flight to Denver. When I arrived at our house on Elm Street, Veronica was already gone. But she'd left Connor behind, a 6-year-old boy whose entire world had just collapsed. I found him sitting on the living room floor, clutching his favorite stuffed elephant, tears streaming down his face. "Mama said Daddy's dying and she can't stay with dying people," he whispered when I hugged him. I wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. Veronica had abandoned her sick husband and traumatized her own child, leaving a 6-year-old to process concepts no child should face alone. I knew exactly how Connor felt. I'd been 6 when my world fell apart too. I tried calling Veronica and her parents dozens of times, but they ignored every attempt at contact. I could have driven to Harold and Beverly's house, but I didn't want to waste precious time with Dad on confrontations with people who'd already shown their true colors. Instead, I focused on what mattered: caring for Dad during his chemotherapy treatments and helping Connor process this trauma. For 3 weeks, I juggled medical appointments, household management, and comforting a confused little boy who couldn't understand why his mother had disappeared. When I had to return to Northwestern to avoid losing my scholarship, I faced an impossible decision about Connor's care. Dad was too sick for round-the-clock parenting, and I had no choice but to take Connor to Harold and Beverly's house in Lakewood. Standing on their front porch with Connor's tiny suitcase, I felt like I was betraying him the same way every other adult in his life had. But this was just the beginning of a much larger battle that would define the rest of our lives. Harold and Beverly's shock when they opened their door and found me standing there with Connor was almost comical, if the situation hadn't been so devastating. They stammered excuses and tried to act surprised, but I could see Veronica's red Jeep Cherokee parked in their driveway. "What are you doing here?" Beverly asked, though her eyes were focused on Connor clinging to my hand. I was done being polite with these people. "Your daughter abandoned her sick husband and 6-year-old son," I said loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Since Dad's in a treatment facility and I have to return to college, Connor needs somewhere to stay." Harold tried to claim they didn't know Veronica had left, but I'd already spotted her peeking through their living room curtains. When I started raising my voice about child abandonment and calling CPS, Veronica finally emerged. She looked different, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes and an overall defeated appearance. But any sympathy I might have felt evaporated when she had the audacity to threaten calling the police on me for causing a disturbance. "I don't care what reasons you had for leaving Dad," I told her, fighting to keep my voice steady with Connor standing right there. "But you will take care of your son." Veronica actually tried to argue that Connor was my responsibility since I was already there taking care of Dad anyway. When I explained that Dad was in a specialized treatment center and I was returning to Northwestern, her face went pale. "Unless you want me calling Child Protective Services right now," I continued, "Connor stays with you." I kissed Connor goodbye, my heart breaking as he clung to me and begged me not to leave him. But I had no choice. I needed to finish my degree so I could eventually support both Dad and Connor if necessary. For the next 2 months, I tried to balance academics with daily phone calls to Dad at the treatment center. He'd tell me he was improving, but I could hear the weakness in his voice growing worse each week. The cruelest part was that Veronica never allowed Connor to visit his dying father, and she ignored every attempt I made to coordinate visits. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Thursday in March. Dad had passed peacefully in his sleep. I'd never felt so alone in my entire life. I flew back to Denver immediately to handle funeral arrangements, a 20-year-old suddenly responsible for decisions no child should have to make. At the funeral, Connor arrived with Harold and Beverly, but Veronica was nowhere to be seen. The moment Connor spotted me, he broke free and ran into my arms, sobbing against my shoulder. In that moment, he truly was all the family I had left in the world. After the service, Harold and Beverly dropped their own bombshell. Veronica had left that very morning. "Left for where?" I asked, though I was still numb with grief. They exchanged uncomfortable looks before Beverly explained that they'd recently discovered Veronica had been having an affair with her ex-boyfriend throughout her entire marriage to Dad. She'd been planning to leave for months but used Dad's cancer as her excuse. "She never wanted to be a mother," Harold admitted, looking ashamed. "We know this is a lot to ask, but we're too old to raise Connor full-time. Would you consider taking him in?" I stared at them in disbelief. They'd enabled their daughter's abandonment of her child, and now they wanted me to clean up the mess. "We'll call CPS right now," I said firmly. "Connor deserves better than adults who abandon him whenever life gets difficult." But Harold explained that CPS was already overwhelmed, and Connor would likely end up in foster care with strangers. They promised to help with babysitting and financial support, but their health issues prevented full-time guardianship. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was love, but looking at Connor's scared little face, I knew I couldn't abandon him too. On the day I lost my father, I became a guardian to my 6-year-old half-brother. The next 3 years were the hardest of my life. I took a gap year from Northwestern, using Dad's life insurance money to rent a small apartment near campus. I enrolled Connor at a local elementary school and tried to balance finishing my degree with single parenting. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Connor would wake up crying for Daddy, or asking when Mama was coming home. I had to explain concepts like death and abandonment to a child while I was still processing my own grief. But Connor was resilient in the way only children can be. He adapted to our new life, excelled at his new school, and slowly began calling me his big sister who takes care of everything. I legally adopted him when he was 8, a process that required lawyers and court appearances but felt like the most natural thing in the world. I graduated from Northwestern with honors, landed a job at a consulting firm in Chicago, and moved us to a better neighborhood. Connor grew into a confident, happy kid who loved video games, basketball, and building Lego sets with me on weekends. We rarely talked about Veronica, though Connor sometimes brought her up. He understood that I was his real family now, and we built a life together based on love and stability rather than obligation and resentment. For 7 years, our life was peaceful. Connor thrived academically and socially, I advanced in my career, and we created traditions and memories that felt authentically ours. Then Veronica called. The call came on a Wednesday evening while Connor and I were making tacos for dinner, our weekly tradition since he'd turned 10. At 13, he was becoming quite the chef, expertly seasoning ground beef while I chopped tomatoes and onions. When my phone rang with an unknown Colorado number, I almost didn't answer. Aria? Where the hell are you, and why did you sell your father's house? Veronica's voice hit me like ice water. After 7 years of silence, she had the audacity to sound angry with me. I sold the house because I'm Connor's legal guardian and we needed the money to build a life together, I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. You know, since you abandoned him. I want to know where Connor is living, she demanded. I'm still his biological mother, and I have rights. I actually laughed out loud. Rights? You threatened to call the police on Dad when he was dying. You left your 6-year-old son with strangers. What rights do you think you have? Connor looked up from the stove, curious about my tone. I gave him a reassuring smile and stepped into the hallway. I know you have legal guardianship, Veronica continued, her voice taking on a manipulative whine, but that doesn't mean I can't see my own son. I'll go to the police if you don't tell me where you're living. Go ahead, I said calmly. I was legally appointed by the courts to care for Connor after you abandoned him. If you try to contact us, I won't hesitate to get a restraining order. Then I said the words I'd been wanting to say for 7 years. You're the worst mother in the world for abandoning your own child. You're lucky I loved Connor enough to step up, because without me, God knows where he'd be right now. Veronica's voice broke, and she started crying. I regret what I did, but I was grieving too. You can't blame me for being overwhelmed. Don't ever call us again, I said. Neither Connor nor I want anything to do with you. I hung up and immediately blocked the number. Connor noticed my shaken expression when I returned to the kitchen. I'd always been honest with him about our family situation, so I explained that Veronica had called asking about him. Do you want to talk to her? I asked, giving him the choice I'd never been given as a child. Connor thought for a moment, then shook his head. She left when I needed her most. You've been my real family all these years. That's all I need. His maturity and loyalty broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. I hugged him tight, promising that I'd continue prioritizing his well-being above everything else. But I also knew Veronica well enough to realize this wouldn't be the end of it. I started documenting everything, keeping records of Connor's school achievements, our living situation, our financial stability, and most importantly, his own stated preferences about contact with his biological mother. 2 weeks later, Harold called to apologize. Apparently, Veronica had been staying with them intermittently, and they'd given her Connor's school information from old records. He assured me they'd spoken to her about respecting our boundaries. Why is she suddenly interested in Connor after all these years? I asked. Harold's pause spoke volumes. The man she left your father for got engaged to someone else. She's at loose ends right now. Of course. Veronica wasn't reaching out because she missed her son or felt genuine remorse. She was looking for purpose and stability after her romantic relationship failed. Connor was just another convenience for her to exploit. I drafted a formal email to Veronica and her parents, clearly outlining Connor's current situation and my legal authority as his guardian. I made it explicitly clear that Connor was thriving in our current arrangement and had no interest in rekindling a relationship with someone who'd abandoned him during his most vulnerable time. The email was professional but firm. Since you chose to walk out of Connor's life the day our father died, I believe you forfeited your right to updates about his well-being. I'm open to maintaining minimal communication with Connor's grandparents for his sake, but I must prioritize his safety and stability above all else. Please don't disturb us again. 6 months passed peacefully. Harold called occasionally to check on Connor, which I appreciated. He'd tell me about Connor's latest basketball games or school projects, and Harold would share stories about Connor with Beverly. It felt like a healthy grandparent relationship without Veronica's toxic influence. Then Harold called with an update I should have expected. Veronica had left again. She thought she could just waltz back into Connor's life and pick up where she left off, he explained. When she realized you weren't going to make it easy, and that Connor wasn't interested in seeing her, she decided it was too much work. Some people never change. Veronica was still the same selfish person who prioritized her own comfort over everyone else's needs, including her own child's emotional well-being. Harold and Beverly assured me they were done enabling their daughter's behavior. They promised to continue supporting Connor from a distance, while respecting the boundaries I'd established for our family's protection. Connor, now 14, continued excelling in school and had started learning to skateboard with his friends. He'd recently celebrated another birthday surrounded by classmates who genuinely cared about him, creating the kind of stable childhood I'd never had but was determined to provide for him. Looking back, I realized that Veronica's brief attempt at re-entry actually strengthened my resolve and clarified my priorities. Connor and I had built something real together, a family based on choice, commitment, and unconditional love rather than biology and obligation. But the most satisfying part? Knowing that Veronica would have to live with the knowledge that she'd thrown away the chance to know an incredible kid who'd grown up just fine without her. 3 years had passed since Veronica's last attempt at contact, and Connor was now a confident 17-year-old preparing for his senior year at Lincoln High School. He'd grown into an amazing young man, tall like Dad, with the same easy smile and work ethic. He played varsity basketball, maintained a 3.8 GPA, and had already been accepted to Colorado State University with a partial athletic scholarship. Our life in Denver had become everything I'd dreamed it could be. I'd been promoted to senior consultant at Morrison & Associates. We'd moved into a beautiful 3-bedroom house in the Cherry Hills neighborhood, and Connor had a solid group of friends who treated our home like their second family. We rarely talked about Veronica anymore. Connor had processed his abandonment issues through therapy during middle school, and while he occasionally expressed curiosity about his biological mother, he was clear about considering me his real family. "You're the one who raised me," he'd say when the subject came up. "That makes you more of a parent than DNA ever could." Then, on a Saturday morning in October, our peaceful life was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. I was in the kitchen making pancakes, Connor's favorite weekend breakfast, when the doorbell rang. Connor was still asleep, typical for a teenager on Saturday morning, so I padded to the front door in my robe and slippers. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Her blonde hair was now streaked with gray, her face looked older and more weathered, and she appeared nervous, shifting from foot to foot on our front porch. It was Veronica. My first instinct was to not answer the door, but curiosity won out. After checking that the door chain was secured, I opened it just wide enough to see her clearly. "What do you want?" I asked without preamble. "Aria, please." "I need to talk to Connor," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I've been clean and sober for 2 years now. I've been in therapy, and I want to make amends." "Clean and sober?" I repeated. "So you had addiction issues too?" She nodded, looking ashamed. "Pills, mostly. It started after Connor was born with the postpartum depression, and it got worse when your father got sick. I know that's no excuse for abandoning my family, but I want Connor to know that I'm trying to be better." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or dishonesty. She appeared genuine, but I'd seen Veronica's acting skills before. "Connor is 17 now," I told her. "He's busy with school, basketball, college preparations, and building his future. He doesn't need the disruption of someone who walked out on him when he was 6 years old." "I understand I hurt him," Veronica continued, tears starting to form in her eyes. "But I'm his mother, Aria. I carried him for 9 months. I gave birth to him. Doesn't that count for something?" "Biology doesn't make you a parent," I replied firmly. "Showing up every day makes you a parent. Being there when your child is scared, sick, or confused makes you a parent. I've been doing that for 11 years while you've been off living your life without a second thought about the son you abandoned." That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me. Connor appeared in the hallway, wearing basketball shorts and a Northwestern University t-shirt I'd gotten him during one of my alumni visits. "Aria? Who's at the door?" he called out, then stopped when he saw my expression. "Is everything okay?" Veronica's face lit up when she heard his voice. "Connor? Connor, it's me. It's your mom." Connor walked closer, studying Veronica's face through the crack in the door. I watched his expression change from curiosity to recognition to something harder to define, not anger exactly, but a kind of distant assessment. "I remember you," he said quietly. "You left when Dad was dying." "Connor, sweetie, I was sick too. I had problems I didn't know how to handle, and I made terrible mistakes. But I've been working on myself, and I want to be part of your life again." Connor looked at me, then back at Veronica. Where have you been for 11 years? I've been struggling, honey. I had addiction issues and mental health problems that I needed to address before I could be a good mother to you. But you could have sent letters, Connor said, his voice growing stronger. You could have called on my birthdays. You could have asked Arya how I was doing in school or if I was okay. You didn't do any of that. Veronica's composure started cracking. I was ashamed. I didn't know how to face what I'd done. So you did nothing, Connor concluded. For 11 years, you did absolutely nothing while Arya gave up her college life to raise me. She took me to every basketball game, helped me with homework, taught me to drive, and made sure I had everything I needed. You want to be part of my life now that I'm almost an adult and don't need a parent anymore. I was so proud of Connor in that moment. He wasn't being cruel, just honest and direct in a way that showed incredible maturity. It's not too late, Veronica pleaded. We could start over. We could build a relationship. Connor shook his head. I'm 17. I'm graduating in 6 months and going to college in Colorado Springs. I have a life here with people who've always been there for me. I don't need a relationship with someone who only wants to be my mother when it's convenient for her. Veronica turned her attention back to me. You've turned him against me. You've poisoned him with your version of what happened. That was the moment I realized she hadn't changed at all. She was still the same person who blamed everyone else for her choices, who expected forgiveness without accountability. I never had to turn Connor against you, I said calmly. Your actions did that all by yourself. I've always been honest with him about what happened, but I never told him he couldn't have a relationship with you if that's what he wanted. This is his choice. Connor, please, Veronica begged. I'm your mother. I love you. No, Connor said firmly. Arya is my family. She's the one who loved me enough to change her entire life for me. She's the one who stayed when everyone else left. If you really loved me, you would have found a way to be there when I needed you most. He took my hand and squeezed it. I'm going back upstairs. Arya, when you're done talking to her, can we still make pancakes? Of course, I told him, my heart swelling with pride and love for this incredible young man I'd had the privilege of raising. After Connor disappeared upstairs, Veronica made one final desperate attempt. I could take you to court, she threatened. Fight for visitation rights. I smiled at her, not a kind smile, but the smile of someone who'd spent years preparing for this exact moment. Go ahead, I said. Take me to court. I have 11 years of documentation showing Connor's academic achievements, his emotional stability, his social development, and his own clearly stated preferences about contact with you. I have records showing that you abandoned him during his father's terminal illness, that you've made no attempt at contact or support, and that you've only reached out now when it's convenient for you. I paused to let that sink in. But more importantly, Connor is 17. In Colorado, judges give significant weight to a teenager's preferences in custody matters. And you just heard exactly what Connor thinks about having a relationship with you. Veronica's face crumpled as the reality hit her. She'd lost her son through her own choices, and no court in the world was going to give her access to a teenager who clearly wanted nothing to do with her. I know I made mistakes, she whispered. You didn't make mistakes, I corrected her. You made choices. You chose to leave when your husband was dying. You chose to abandon your 6-year-old son. You chose to ignore him for 11 years while I raised him. And now you're choosing to show up and demand a relationship you never earned. I started to close the door, then paused. Connor is an amazing young man. He's kind, intelligent, hardworking, and resilient. He's going to do incredible things with his life. But none of that has anything to do with you. He became who he is despite you, not because of you. I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a moment listening to my own heartbeat. Through the window, I watched Veronica walk slowly back to her car, a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days. When I got back to the kitchen, Connor was already there, pulling ingredients out of the refrigerator. You okay? He asked, giving me a concerned look. I'm perfect, I told him honestly. How are you feeling? Connor thought for a moment while he cracked eggs into a bowl. Relieved, I guess. I always wondered what I'd say if I ever saw her again. Now I know. Any regrets about how you handled it? No, he said without hesitation. I meant everything I said. You're my real family, Arya. You always have been. We made pancakes together like we had hundreds of Saturday mornings before, talking about his upcoming basketball season and college plans. Veronica's visit felt like the closing of a chapter rather than the opening of one, a final confirmation that the life we'd built together was exactly what it should be. 3 months later, Connor graduated as valedictorian of his class. In his graduation speech, he talked about resilience, family, and the people who choose to love us unconditionally. He never mentioned Veronica by name, but when he looked at me in the audience and said, "Thank you to the person who taught me that family isn't about biology, it's about showing up every single day," I knew exactly who he was talking about. Veronica never contacted us again. Harold called occasionally to check on Connor, and he mentioned that Veronica had moved to Florida and seemed to be doing better with her recovery. I was genuinely glad to hear she was getting help, but I felt no obligation to facilitate a relationship between her and Connor. Connor is now in his sophomore year at Colorado State, majoring in business with a minor in sports management. He calls me every Sunday, comes home for holidays, and still considers me his real family. He's dating a sweet girl named Lauren who makes him laugh, and he's already talking about graduate school. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret giving up my early 20s to raise my half-brother. The answer is simple, not for a single second. Connor didn't just become my responsibility, he became my purpose, my joy, and my greatest achievement. Veronica thought she could walk back into our lives after 11 years and reclaim a relationship she'd never earned. But she learned what I'd known all along: being a parent isn't about biology or convenience. It's about commitment, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Connor and I built our family from scratch, through grief and challenges and small daily acts of caring. That's something no one can take away from us, no matter how late they decide they want to be part of the story. And in the end, that's exactly what made Veronica pay for what she'd done. Not revenge or anger, but the simple fact that the son she abandoned grew up just fine without her, surrounded by people who chose to love him every single day.